We're going to talk about the security K. Okay. This is my favorite critique because I think that it forces you to thoroughly engage with the nuances of the affirmative. Like, no two security K speeches should ever be entirely alike. And I think that it's a great way to think about. So if you're a policy person who's trying to learn how the K works, I think it's a great way to kind of transition and figure out how that kind of functions. But if you're a K person who thinks that K debate is just so radically different than policy debate, then I think the security K is a great example of how it does not have to be so very different from policy debate, but can kind of still do a lot of the techie line by line, very particular to what the affirmative is saying, kinds of things that I think would elevate your ability to go for any of your arguments at all. So the thesis of the security K is really simple, and there's really only two things that you need to know. Number one, the way we talk and think about policies influences those policies. And number two, the affs securitization is bad. And I will underline several times aff. So the way we talk and think about policies influences or shapes them or directs them in such a manner that certain outcomes or effects necessarily happen. So in other words, we're thinking about rhetoric and we're thinking about epistemology. Right? These two things matter because, as it turns out, how we come to know how the world works, either epistemically or rhetorically, does actually influence the way that we interact with other beings in this world. Right? So the way that we talk and think about policies influences and shapes them. This feels very incredibly obvious to me, and it kind of baffles me that anyone disagrees with this idea, because it's just a fact about how the world works, right? No two policies are ever exactly the same, and the reason that they're all different from each other is because we talk about them differently, we think about them differently, we do them for different reasons. Right? So we have to consider rhetoric and epistemology when conducting and or thinking about policy. You all should shut your computers, take out something. Grab paper. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as far as the thesis of the K goes, is that it is about the affirmative securitization in particular being a bad thing. The affirmative securitization in particular is a bad thing. Not all securitization, but the affirmative securitization. The affirmative securitization. In other words, you should be reading cards about the affirmative and the impacts that the affirmative has read, as opposed to just big, broad, like neocleosinate securitization is bad sometimes. This, by the way, is also how you deal with the EarthCon, which I don't think is actually an argument, style responses from the affirmative when they're like, OMG, you also read a securitized impact. How dare you also criticize those things? Your response is then, yeah, we think that is actually a threat. We think what you have said is not a threat. That is a hyped up instance. What we've said is not a hyped up instance. Right? So the more particular to the affirmative, the less constrained you have to be in your strategy. But that's it. Those are the only things that you have to defend. You're not saying that policies necessarily are bad. You're not saying the state is evil. You're not criticizing fiat, whatever other random things people love to throw in when reading a critique, and like Dave's greatest hits kind of thing. So you don't have to do that. And in fact, I don't think you should do that because it radically constrains what arguments the affirmative can say in response to your argument. So rhetoric and epistemology matters, which is just a truth claim about how the world works. The fact that anyone thinks they can read a card to say otherwise is moronic. And by the way, none of those cards actually say that. The cards we tag as like epistemology doesn't matter or rhetoric doesn't matter. None of those authors say that. So the way we talk and think about policies influences and shapes them, and the affs securitization in particular is a bad thing. Any questions so far? Seems pretty basic, pretty easy. I would generally agree with that. When you're thinking about deploying your links and your impacts arguments, I want you to always put them together. Always put them together. The easiest strategy for an affirmative to beat is when the negative K team stands up and says, now the permutation, all of the links are disadvantages. I will extend them all here. We have 5. And then just extends the link arguments and doesn't explain any of the impact arguments. The problem with not having any of the impact arguments attached to particular link arguments is that who cares? Right? There's no reason it is a bad thing that the affirmative links, triggers that particular link. Right? It's not an answer to anything that the affirmative has said. Right? So think about it this way. If you're reading if you're reading a cybersecurity app, it's like, we gotta securitize Russia, deter against them, etc. The next stands up and it's like, that's a link. You've securitized Russia. And then they stop there. Right? The smart affirmative is going to stand up and be like, hell yeah, we securitized Russia. That's a good thing. We read 17 cards in the 1AC saying that securitizing Russia is a good thing. And then the case outweighs the K. Right? So the smarter negative move would be to say, you securitize Russia. That creates the conditions for conflict, which turns the entire affirmative, proves that you have a fidelity to a problematic social structure, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You have to impact your link arguments. You have to impact your link arguments. This is, I think, true of every critique, but particularly true of the security K, because every affirmative is just going to impact her. Right? So you have to be very good at explaining the impacts to each of your link arguments and not just your link arguments. Like, newsflash, you're going to win a link. Like, that's non-controversial. If you don't win a link, then you need to go back to the drawing board and reconsider. Like you probably haven't read a card if you're not winning. Like I quite literally cannot imagine a world where you don't win a link to the security K on this topic. Right? So that's useless. Just standing up and being like, here are my 5 links. Let me just very briefly say these. 1, you securitized Russia. 2, you securitized, like, useless. Explain your impacts. Tell me why those things matter. Every link story needs an impact. So I'll give you all some vernacular to kind of think about how you can word or describe some of your link and impact stories. You do not have to use these things, but I think they are good approaches or ways to kind of get you thinking about how you want to talk about your impacts. So the first one is what I like to call the militarism dissent, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying that the affirmative incentivizes U.S. interventions abroad. The affirmative incentivizes U.S. interventions abroad. You might decide to call the aff a hegemonic saviorism complex. a hegemonic saviorism complex, which is, saviorism, savior. The West has to be the savior of the world, right? The way that they come to understand how the world works is such that we have to intervene with our military in order to stop those threats. The easiest example of this is with a terrorism impact. Post 9/11 kind of demonstrates this, right? Massive terrorist attack. We securitized it. US intervenes in two sovereign nations and destroys a lot of stuff. Does a lot of damage. Obviously, there are about 10 million other examples, right? So the more that we securitize Russia, the more likely we are to go to conflict with them. The more that we securitize China, the more likely we are to go to conflict. Right? But what this means is twofold. External impact, right? They cause conflict. And here's the case. I.e., they make their own impact more likely. Right? To return to the terrorism example, okay, we're so worried about a hyped up nuclear terrorist attack that we decide to preemptively retaliate or preemptively respond, I guess, before they've even had the chance to attack. Right? Which develops this hegemonic saviorism complex. We think that we have to save the world from a nuclear terrorist strike. So we decide to intervene in a variety of countries throughout the Middle East and potentially Southeast Asia. That causes conflicts insofar as, we go there and we blow shit up, right? We kill a bunch of people. And it also turns the case because it creates blowback terrorism, right? The more that the United States intervenes in sovereign nations and destroys people's livelihoods, the more they have incentives to join the very groups that we are attempting to stop. Right, so you should get both an external impact and a turns case argument. Second is the violence DA. Which is to say that we only understand impacts as impacts if we hype up the threats, if we securitize them, if we make them up, if we make them worse than they actually could be. Which means we don't worry about things that are actually occurring, which matter, and also create the conditions for those other hyped up impacts. So we only worry about impacts if they're and if they're hyped up, which means we don't worry about other things that are occurring, other impacts that are actually occurring, and that oftentimes create the conditions of possibility of those larger impacts. Right, so climate change. We worry about it in terms of an existential risk, which means that we decide to develop some strange internal link chain to attempt to alleviate it, to stop it from becoming existential, right? So we need to have NATO cohesion to be strong organization among a bunch of actors together in order to attempt to resolve an existential climate change. The problem is then we no longer worry about the proximate causes of climate change. So like, I don't know, the oil and gas industry, the largest corporations in the world who are responsible for, I don't remember if it's 70% or 90%, but most of the world's pollution. Right? And instead, we allow those proximate causes of climate change to continue in favor of attempting to resolve some immediate, hyped up internal link to climate change, which both A, means the aff doesn't actually solve climate change because they don't stop the reasons why climate change happens. And B, it's just bad decision making, right? It's a bad educational model. It's bad practice. This also means that the app is anti-utilitarian. So what's utilitarian? Functionally, that's how we use it in debates. Yeah, greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. In debate, we shortcut that to say, save the most lives. The problem with that shortcut is that we then don't think about what proximate causes or greatest amounts of good in other capacities could actually save more lives. Right? So the assumption that we should worry about a made-up extinction scenario is one that belies the kinds of structural and systemic causes for that extinction scenario to occur, which then therefore means that the affirmative, the kind of epistemic and rhetorical focus of the affirmative, is one in which we are really bad utilitarian decision makers because we're not actually worried about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. We're worried about like we've messed that up. We've misunderstood that. Which means that according to their own calculus, because the affirmative is going to stand up and probably read a util card, right? Under their own calculus, they should lose. Right? We're better at it than them. Third is the error replication DA. Which functionally is serial policy failure. Because again, if epistemology and rhetoric shape the policies that occur, then if we've proven that the affirmative's epistemology and rhetoric is faulty, it's made up, it's securitized, then it proves that the policy that the affirmative creates only replicates its own impacts. So I will repeat that because that is maybe a controversial take on critiques in 2022. If we win that the affs rhetoric or epistemology is faulty, then it means that the affs policy only recreates its own impacts. Because the way we talk and think about policies influences and shapes them. Are there any questions thus far? Yeah. Yeah, if you can. That'd be awesome. The affirmative policy
Add cyber to A5.
Mhm. So we add cyber to A5 because we think that it deters Russia, because we're so concerned that the the state itself of Russia is attempting to use cyber to take out United States defense capabilities, and that could spiral into a nuclear conflict. Okay, that is the approach we take in doing that policy, which means the concern, the thing we're attempting to deal with, is a nuclear conflict between the US and Russia, right? The worst case scenario. The problem is that the response we've taken to doing that is one which is offensive, right? We should develop offensive capabilities and we should connect them with our NATO allies, and therefore say, let's get 30 some odd countries all together and say, F you, Russia, if you attack, we will attack them. Okay. Which creates the conditions of possibility for a nuclear war, right? There's very good evidence that suggests the only way that a conflict between Russia and the US escalates is if we do Article 5, right? Because Russia doesn't actually care about like taking down US hegemony or demolishing like the West's leadership or something like that, right? Like they have historical incentives for attempting to encroach upon NATO in the Baltics because I don't know, like historical land grabs, kind of wanting to restore what am I trying to say? Historical land grabs, like cultural incentives to kind of reconnect countries and peoples that were disconnected after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So when we respond to Russia by taking it one step further and saying, hey, cyber Article 5 with offensive weapons, Russia's not going to stop probing because they're just trying to figure out what they can and cannot do. We find one of those probes, we escalate immediately. Right? So the affirmative actually creates the conditions of possibility for a US-Russia nuclear war. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Versus if an affirmative says, let's develop defensive capabilities and give those defensive capabilities to our NATO allies, right? Because we're like, hey, it would be cool if we're like, hey, look, yes, Russia is doing some cyber attacks. They are getting some sensitive data. We don't really want to get that sensitive data for whatever reasons. Let's develop defensive capabilities so we can actually protect against those cyber attacks, right? It's the way that we've come to know why we should do that action, right? We've come to know we should do the affirmative because US-Russia nuclear war, versus we've come to know we should do defensive actions because we want to protect people's rights, right? So how we think about things shapes the things that we do. Other questions? Yeah, Gia.
Ones that Russia isn't power, but also that weak on like their current I guess
Potentially. It depends on what you mean by revisionism and what the implications of that are, right? To say Russia is a revisionist power and just stop it at, they would like to restore regional hegemony, like they, like the idea of kind of Soviet, I was going to say Soviet Union, but that's a little bit confusing. That's not what I'm trying to say. Thank you. Sphere of influence is the word I'm looking for, right? They want their sphere of influence for cultural and historical reasons, not because they're like, hey, F you, US, like we would like to go to war with you, right? It is different, right? How do we come to know that they're revisionist? Why do we think they're revisionist? Why do we think that matters? What do we think they're trying to accomplish? Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the alternative. So the alt that's in the actual security K file right now is something like, I don't remember exactly what's worded, but like, let's find new political imaginaries, which is like kind of accurate, because if this is your position with the critique, right, that the way we talk and think about policies matters, and the affs particular securitization is problematic and creates the conditions of possibility for conflict, then your alt doesn't really have to do that much, right? You just need to change something about the way that the affirmative has come to know how the world works, and instead suggest something else. So I always understand this as, don't do that. Right? Don't do that. Stop it. Bad app. Bad. Stop it. Right? Like the example I just gave John is actually a really good example of this. So A5, cyber, deter Russia, nuclear war. Like, that's bad. Bad. Bad way of approaching the world. We should not do that policy. Right? Don't do that. Instead, maybe defensive capabilities. Right? Maybe it's diplomacy. Maybe it's, I don't know, moving, that's kind of a defensive capability, I guess, but like diversifying the grid. I guess that's kind of defensive, whatever.
Do you think this would be like a good thing?
We're gonna get there in 1 second. I think the answer is no, but we'll get there in 1 second. Right, so if we're saying don't do that to the affirmative, then we could potentially defend an alternative paradigm which develops possible policies. Right? Are you all familiar with the word paradigm? Does anyone know what this word means?
Like a set of ideas or ideologies that guides decision making?
Basically. So a paradigm is functionally a way to approach how the world works. Right? It's a way to approach how the world works, and therefore is kind of the theoretical, the epistemic, the rhetorical approach that we take in determining what actions should occur. Right? So based on this first thesis here, the way we talk and think about policies influences and shapes them. What you're saying is that the affirmative's paradigm is a bad thing. Right? It is a paradigm which results in a policy that we should call into question. So instead, when we say don't do that, that's a bad idea, what we're suggesting is a different paradigm for decision making, which could result in alternative policies that would resolve the actual issues that the affirmative is attempting to do. I say could, not would. Could, because you're not fiating all of these policies. Right? Instead, you're saying that this alternative paradigm for decision-making calculus that says don't do that, do something else, is a good idea. Right? So your alternative is to defend the paradigm. The way you explain why the paradigm is good is via examples of policies that could happen. Examples of policies that could happen. And if you're really good about thinking about what these policies could be, then they should be able to resolve the affirmative's impacts and also your own impacts, right? So your alt should solve the aff. Also potentially a controversial take now, but should not be a controversial take. Your alt should solve the aff. Should solve the aff. Your alt should solve the aff. I don't know why we all forget that. If your alt solves the aff, then it takes away any reason why the aff might be a good idea. Right? The aff could win the impact turn. They could win that securitizing Russia is a good idea. But if the alternative solves the conditions of possibility of US-Russian conflict, then they don't win a try or die ballot. Instead, risk calculus means the judge should vote negative. Right? So explain why your alt solves the aff. Explain why your alternative paradigm, which could result in possible policies, is a better idea, or resolves their own empathic acts. Now, to get to the question of whether you're a PIC, I think the answer is no. I do not think that you should make this a PIC. Do not think you should make this a PIC. Two reasons. One, PICs are bad. You're not going to win that debate. Two is, if the way that we talk and think about policies influences and shapes them, then we never actually do the affirmative, right? The alternative cannot do the affirmative because it operates in a different paradigm. The policies that your paradigm could result in cannot be the policy that the affirmative results in, because it is a different understanding of how the world works and a different understanding of what should be done. Yeah. Oh, PIC is, so PIK stands for planning critique, which basically says we will do the affirmative minus the thing that we are criticizing. But based on this first premise here, right, epistemology and rhetoric shapes policies, that literally cannot make sense, because you can't do the app, because you're saying the app is bad. Yeah. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I think no. There are some people who disagree with me. It is a relatively uncontroversial opinion to suggest that the negative does not get to read a PIC with a K. Usually PICs are only competitive if it is out of a word in the plain text, which I don't think this case is. Is this idea kind of making sense? Yeah. I like the alt that's in the generic because I think that it gives you room to make this argument, to make the paradigm argument, right? If we should reimagine the political possibilities, what you're saying is we should have a different paradigm for doing policymaking. And then you should, think of the policies that could happen based on what the affirmative is and what the affirmative is attempting to solve. But I don't think that's a hard question. I think that's just have you read through the affirmative? Do you understand what it's saying? And are you making the critique about the affirmative, which you should be making the claim about the affirmative? Other questions? Okay, so if it's about paradigm, it's about how we've come to know that a policy is a good idea, then that means that the term doesn't make sense. Because your alternative is the opposite of the affirmative. Your alternative is the opposite of the affirmative. Right? So if their policy is only possible, but this is also part of why I said, don't do that, is a good way to conceptualize thinking about your alternative, right? If the app says we should cyber A5 with NATO, and your alt says, no, we should not cyber A5 with NATO, you cannot both do something and not do something, right? It doesn't make any sense. This is also part of why you want to use the word could when you're talking about policies, right? Could, not should, because the word should implies fiat. It implies vote negative to do these things. And these things are potentially permutable, maybe. But your paradigm, which is the thing that you're actually defending as your alternative, is not compatible with the affirmative or the affirmative paradigm. right? Which means that it literally can't make sense together, or it's severance. Now, if the affirmative stands up and is like, makes this silly framework arg of like, just weigh the plan, it's only about the plan, nothing else matters, then they should lose on presumption. And that's true in all instances, because then they don't have an advantage, right? They don't have a reason that plan's a good idea. If the aff stands up and is like, it's only about the plan, just weigh the plan, that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, that's not how we think about things in terms in like the policy debates either. Because if it was just about the plan or just links to the plan, then you wouldn't get to say impact terms. Right, so that argument's done. So notice how, oh, it really sucks, but let's hit it now. Oh well. Notice how I have not talked about the one thing that everyone thinks we need to talk about, which is framework. This will be my hottest of the hottest takes so far this morning, my most controversial opinion in 2022, which is that you don't need a framework argument. You don't need a framework argument. You do not need a framework argument. You do not need a framework argument. Because all of your arguments are about why the aff is a bad idea. All of your arguments are about why the aff is a bad idea. We should not do the affirmative because a result of the affirmative is all of their impacts happen and external conflict impacts. Right? So when the affirmative stands up and is like, framework, evaluate the one I see, fairness, smooth take minutes, blah, 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 whatever. You should be like, cool, agreed. Evaluate the one you see, we're an impact into it. I think it's a bad idea. We think voting negative, you should vote negative and say the app is a bad idea. So again, remember one of the things that I said at the beginning of the lecture is part of the amazing thing about making the K as specific to the affirmative as you can is that it gets rid of all this like random external nonsense the affirmative could say to beat your critique. Right? So judges love a good, oh, I voted aff because they won framework ballot. Judges love that ballot. But if your argument is that doesn't matter, who cares? We agree to weigh the aff, we think it's a bad idea, then that ballot goes away. Right? It takes away what is probably the most common response to the critique, which is weigh the aff against the K. Right? So the heavy reliance on the framework strategy, I think it's a shortcut to letting the affirmative not have to answer your critique. I will also add that I have spent so much time thinking about this, and I genuinely don't understand how framework interpreters. I don't like this Venn diagram. This is a bad one. I don't really understand how framework interpreters are so different. Right. So if the aff is like weigh the affirmative against the K, and the neg is like evaluate the affirmative as an object of research, right? Or evaluate their like, I don't know, the way they've come, like their research. Yeah, object of research. Right? Those are the same things. Those are the same things. How do you weigh the affirmative against the critique unless you're thinking about the affirmative and its advantages? I.e., unless you're thinking about the conclusions that the affirmative has drawn from the research that has been done and that has gone into the creation of that 1AC. And then on the flip side, how do you evaluate the affirmative as an object of research unless you're also thinking about the plan? Because the plan is the conclusion that has been drawn from the object of research. Right? It just like genuinely baffles me. Like there are framework interps that can be diametrically opposed to each other. Like if the neg stands up and is like, ignore the aff, just like, nope, no aff at all, right? Or if the affirmative stands up and is like, there are no Ks in the Ds, like obviously those things are very opposed to each other, right? That's a bit of a different question. But the way that everyone interprets framework is just, you're saying the same thing, you're just saying it with different words. I was going to try and draw a Venn diagram to like visually illustrate this, but I don't know. I can't seem to draw it right now. Let me try again. One more time. Clearly, there we go. So it's like, this is kind of how I think about it. It's like, if this is the affs interp, is this other one here, weigh the plan. Right, and this is the next interp that's like object study or whatever it is. There's so much overlap, and that's the only way that it can make sense in debate. And these parts that don't overlap are irrelevant. If I'm just weighing the plan and I'm not thinking about the affirmative as an object of research, then I should vote neg on presumption because they don't have an advantage. If I'm just thinking about the affirmative as an object of study or an object of research, and I'm not also evaluating the plan, then who cares? What are the implications of this? Right? It's not like we're all like, we go into a debate and someone said something like we should deter Russia because they're evil and Putin is a dictator or whatever. And so like we then go out and are like, yes, this is the thing that I've learned and I believe this. This is absolutely true. Like that's asinine. Right? So the distinctions between these things are meaningless in a debate. So anyways, I think framework's silly when you're reading a K against an app or when you're app against a K. I think you have to beat the merits of the criticism, or if you're negative, you should make the K about the app. All right, I feel like I've rambled enough. We have about 6 more minutes for questions. Yeah, Gia.
I guess like limited reference, they just want to hear the influence, but they don't talk about that's if they don't expect to stop that like results both between NATO and Russia. And then like we're saying like, you know, the anti-securitizing it and all these things, whatever, right? Can both be like negative to be correct that like we are that the app is securitizing against Russia and say that like say they're reading like the Baltics advantage or whatever, that like we need to do the affirmative in order to prevent Russia from invading the Baltics because that will cause war with like NATO. Like both of those be true at once, and how could like the negative like try to get a ballot off that because then the affirmative probably does have a true reason why the app should be done.
Potentially, I could see a world where those things are both true together. I can also see a world where that flips my decision calculus in favor of the negative. So if securitizing Russia causes conflict in the Baltics, then serial policy failure, that impact is inevitable and it's not a unique advantage to the affirmative. Granted, the affs response is going to be something like a time frame distinction. We got to solve like a short-term impact, in which case you should call into question that decision-making calculus. That's the logic that the violence dissad is talking about and saying is problematic, right? Because when we attempt to jump at every little threat, we sidestep and ignore the conditions that actually cause those threats to occur. That's a bad way of doing policymaking. I would also argue like the alt solves the aff anyways, right? So if you've got your paradigm that could result in particular policies that are really awesome and solve, you know, Russia invading the Baltics or solve nuclear conflict between US and Russia, then there's only a risk of the alternative being preferable to the affirmative. So yes, that is a concern, and I see where you're coming from, and I think that'd be a pretty smart argument, yeah. But I don't think it's insurmountable. I think you can deal with it. Does that make sense?